If you've ever had to give blood at a hospital, you know how big of a hassle it can be. For many, a needle is inserted, painfully drawing vials of blood. During this process, a lot of people feel dizzy and some even faint. Moreover, in many cases, the needle used to collect blood, the chemicals to stabilize the blood within those vials, and the machines in the laboratories where your blood is sent are not standardized. Taking your blood to those labs takes time. In the labs, large and expensive machines are used for each test. It's a process filled with discomfort at every step. What if we could eliminate all of this and just take a few drops of blood with a finger prick, just like in diabetes tests? Then we could insert it into a small and affordable machine, even keeping it at our homes. We could test everything from cancer to medication levels, hormones to cholesterol levels, and various diseases all at once. We could even send these results to an expert instantly over the internet. This way, our results could be evaluated not in days or weeks, but in just a few hours. Wouldn't that be amazing? This was the exact promise Elizabeth Holmes made when she left Stanford University at the age of 19 and founded a new venture in Silicon Valley in the year 2003. Theranos was meant to rewrite the blood testing industry. It was supposed to be humanity's greatest invention after antibiotics. Instead, Theranos became the biggest fraud in human history and Silicon Valley's greatest blunder. This is the chilling story of Elizabeth Holmes, one of the most unsettling fraudsters of recent times. Born into the Holmes family in 1994, with connections to various political leaders and entrepreneurs, Elizabeth developed an interest in computer programming during her high school years. Her actual interest in and performance in classes were not particularly noteworthy, but her family conditioned her from an early age to achieve wealth as well. Although her grades wouldn't naturally grant her access, they directed her towards an unconventional path known as the back door. Accessible only to the wealthy to get into a prestigious school. They knew she needed to attend a top-tier school, but her grades weren't up to par, so they steered her towards learning Mandarin as a means. In fact, Holmes earned her initial money by selling C++ compilers to Chinese companies. Yet, Elizabeth didn't want to learn Mandarin. When she was forcibly sent to China, she repeatedly called her family, stating that the local cuisine was foul-smelling and terrible. But she had been conditioned she had to be successful and wealthy. Indeed, in 2002, Elizabeth entered the chemical engineering department at Stanford University, determined to become a billionaire. During a trip to Asia in 2003, witnessing the SARS outbreak, she believed that a groundbreaking health technology could be the key to reach billions and change the world. Elizabeth was relentless, stopping at nothing until she became a billionaire. After returning from Asia, she worked on a patent idea for 5 days, almost without sleep. She aimed to create a device that could generate a comprehensive health profile from a single drop of blood. This device eventually, rather ironically, transformed into a small black box called Edison. She chose the name Edison because, like Thomas Edison, she had failed thousands of times before reaching a successful product. You know Edison saying, "I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." But when it came to Elizabeth's dream, there was a small problem with this grand attitude. Her 10,001st attempt also didn't work. Actually, it wouldn't have worked. If you were to ask any engineer or lab technician, they would tell you that devices that detect a person's health indicators using blood samples utilize various methods. For instance, some of them pass the blood through charged electrodes placed close to the size of a blood cell, counting the cells by monitoring impedance changes as they pass through. Some tests involve mixing the blood with certain chemicals to examine how it changes. In certain tests, centrifugation separates the blood into different components. Each test requires a certain amount of blood to yield meaningful results. Therefore, the more tests you want to perform, the more tubes of blood are drawn based on the minimum required amount for those tests. Otherwise, doctors aren't interested in more blood than necessary. Efforts to reduce the required blood volume for specific tests do exist. However, until now, no technology has been developed that can reduce the required blood volume for numerous tests simultaneously. Yet Holmes was chasing a unicorn. She was selling her investors a dream of performing hundreds, even over 1,000 tests with just a drop or a few drops of blood. Additionally, there are engineering reasons behind the size of some blood testing devices. For instance, due to the extreme sensitivity of some tests, we need to ensure that the devices are not affected by the electromagnetic fields of nearby equipment. This often requires significant insulation around the sensors and sometimes a considerable distance. You're ignoring these aspects. If you stack the fundamental parts of all types of testing devices on top, under and next to each other, the devices would interfere with each other and produce erroneous results. Edison was a device too small to be true and wasn't true indeed. Yet this minor detail was completely inconsequential for Elizabeth Holmes. What mattered was making confident strides on the path that would let her conquer the world. Former employees who were either fired from Theranos or eventually left due to ethical concerns claim that Innes's devices in the laboratories never worked. They share stories of parts falling off the devices during tests, and often tests not being completed due to malfunctions. As later became apparent, Theranos could only test about 10% of the blood they received from patients using their device. For the rest, they pretended to test them using their own devices while actually conducting the tests on larger machines already used in the industry, such as Siemens machines. This was Elizabeth's primary approach: pretend as if. They built laboratories that seemed to work with their own products. They deceived investors as if they had a functioning product. Without hesitation, they provided patients with erroneous results measured by Edison instead of accurate results. They disregarded patients' rights for years. You might wonder how she could be so successful like this. The secret lies in Elizabeth Holmes, a master manipulator, and the human vulnerabilities she exploited. For instance, the first person she manipulated and deceived was Ramesh Balvani, a Pakistani immigrant she met during a trip to India. Balvani, known as Sonny, was 37 years old when he met the then 18-year-old Elizabeth Holmes, who was described as exceptionally attractive by those around her. Sonny, who had made around $40 million as an investor during the 1999 internet bubble, seemed to be influenced by Elizabeth's interest in him, possibly due to her being an appealing woman. They eventually became a couple. A few years later, Sonny joined Theranos as its president, responsible for managing the company's daily operations. However, there's something odd here. He had no medical education or biomedical background. Balvani was a software engineer who had previously worked for companies like Microsoft. This was precisely Elizabeth's tactic. She manipulated and gathered individuals who lacked any actual experience in the biomedical field, but were wealthy and influential, using her cleverness and persuasive lies. This way, she legitimized herself. At one point, the Theranos board of directors included former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, former Senators Sen Nan and William Frist, former CEO of Wells Fargo Bank Richard Kovacevic, former Navy Admiral Gary Rougheed, former president of an engineering and construction company Bechtel Group Riley Bechtel, and former United States Marine Corps General James Mattis. You'd think they were there to draw blood from a different place, not just a finger. Jokes aside, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Holmes didn't care about revolutionizing the healthcare sector. These names were her shield and weapons. They were her legitimizing facade for the whole world. Holmes manipulated these powerful men, using them to manipulate and gain influence. Her aim was to become wealthy by bending them to her will. In fact, her whole life was devoted to this purpose. Holmes knew she was playing in a world dominated by men, and she acted accordingly. She had chosen Apple's founder and former CEO Steve Jobs as her idol. She dressed in turtleneck black sweaters like he did. She mimicked his poses for photographs. She even saved a newspaper clipping from a local newspaper that labeled her the Steve Jobs of the healthcare industry. Back when she wasn't very popular yet, she moved with security guards, just like Steve Jobs did. She worked with advertising agencies that also worked with Apple. She praised the Edison device as the iPhone of the healthcare industry. She hired former Apple employees like Justin Maxwell and Adam Wallman, who had been part of the original iPhone design team. According to Theranos employees, Elizabeth Holmes deliberately deepened her voice to a baritone, believing that speaking with such a voice made her sound more authoritative and commanding. In fact, in a podcast she participated in before she became famous, we can briefly hear her real voice, but afterwards she quickly adjusted it to sound deeper. However, regardless of the circumstances, Holmes, with her lies and deceived individuals, skills, came very close to achieving her goals. Despite never producing even a single product that would advance the Edison device, she managed to raise the company's valuation to around $9 or $10 billion. This meant that the company, without a single working product, was more valuable than Airbnb or Uber at the time. And it also meant that Elizabeth Holmes, who controlled over 55% of the company, became the richest self-made woman in history with a fortune of around $4.5 billion. Holmes had finally reached the pinnacle, and all she had to do was maintain the facade of lies. Yet this was not so easy. Despite her alluring demeanor, Elizabeth had to confront those who questioned her and her skills both within and outside the company. And she couldn't tolerate criticism. By this point, she had already dismissed many individuals who had challenged her and her ethical stance. Everyone feared her. By this point, she had already dismissed many individuals who had challenged her and her ethical stance. Everyone feared her and Sonny. The teams in the laboratories were afraid to even talk to each other. But the question they were asking was why patients weren't informed when incorrect results were obtained. Because the tests conducted on Theranos' devices, based on a technology that used minimal amounts of blood and didn't work properly, could produce any kind of result. Consistency between two tests was impossible. Employees found the results akin to flipping a coin. However, doctors altered patients' medication and transitioned to new treatments based on these test results. For instance, a man whose medication had been changed based on Theranos' results suffered a heart attack a month later. The data from Theranos had shown that he was improving. Instead of providing information to patients, Elizabeth wanted to delete results that were considered inaccurate, manipulating the device's success rates unethically. One of those who were fired for questioning Elizabeth was going to change everything. Tyler Schultz, the grandson of former Secretary of State George Shultz, who was one of the illustrious members of Elizabeth's board of directors, couldn't bear the ethical violations. Tyler eventually resigned and shared his concerns with his grandfather. Aston Shingley, his grandfather, supported Elizabeth Holmes instead of his own grandson. Realizing he was being ignored, Tyler, unable to take it any longer, anonymously reached out to John Carreyrou, an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, to share what he knew under a false name. Carreyrou knew that the Whistleblowers' revelations had significant news value. This was because it involved not only a multi-billion-dollar company, but also a situation that wouldn't result in mere inconvenience like a service interruption on platforms like Facebook or Twitter. Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos were playing with people's health. However, Carreyrou faced a minor issue. Rupert Murdoch, the owner of the Wall Street Journal, was also the largest investor in Theranos, with over $121 million, following $150 million investment by the Walton family, owners of the Walmart supermarket chain. When the journalist delved into investigating Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes became furious and escalated the situation to Murdoch. But Murdoch made a critical decision, stating that he trusted his editors and had no doubt that they would reveal the truth, and he allowed his own newspaper to investigate a company he had invested in. After conducting his research, journalist John Carreyrou published 2 articles and eventually released a book called Bad Blood, revealing what he had discovered to the public and company executives. After this point, the downfall of Theranos was imminent. Of course, Elizabeth Holmes appeared on television the next day to defend herself and her company. She said things like, "This is what happens when you try to change the world. They say you're crazy, then suddenly you've changed the world." But these words no longer held the same power, and both the US Food and Drug Administration and the US Department of Justice, along with the Securities and Exchange Commission, initiated investigations into Theranos, sending surprise inspectors to their laboratories. As a result of the investigations, Theranos' web of lies began to unravel one by one. At one point, even the President of the United States, Joe Biden, had visited Theranos and had been highly impressed, praising the company. However, it appeared that the company had set up a makeshift laboratory from scratch just for the President's visit and had shown him completely fake devices. As I said, pretending was something Elizabeth excelled at. In an interview that had made her famous and even earned her a Fortune magazine cover, cover, Elizabeth Holmes had claimed that the company's portable testing devices could perform more than 200 tests simultaneously, and that they were on track to increase it to 1,000 tests. She also stated that the devices were being used by the US military in war zones and helicopters. These claims had attracted investors, but they were all pure lies. In reality, the Edison device could perform a maximum of about 12 tests, which wasn't an achievement that could elevate a company's value to billions of dollars. The lies of the company stretched back as far as 2006. A prototype presented in Switzerland back then was designed to work just well enough to convince investors, but in reality, no functioning product had ever been consistently produced. This strategy was borrowed from Steve Jobs. However, Jobs had the ability to have the product ready in some form or another by launch day. Elizabeth Holmes. In fact, scientists had tried to raise awareness about Theranos' lies. In 2015, Dr. John Ioannidis, a medical professor at Stanford University, had pointed out in the Journal of the American Medical Association that Elizabeth Holmes had provided no evidence to date that devices like the Edison actually worked, warning investors. Upon hearing this, Holmes reached out to Ioannidis requesting him to retract his article. The professor ignored her request. A few months later, Dr. Eleftherios Diamandis, a clinical biochemist, also cautioned in a paper published in JAMA that Theranos was selling baseless dreams, but nobody listened. The investigations revealed that between 2013 and 2016, Theranos had produced 7.8 million test results from over 1.5 million tests conducted on more than 75,000 patients. Only about 10% of these tests were performed on the Edison device, and all of them were cancelled or needed corrections. The remaining 90% of the tests were primarily done on conventional devices, thus the results were accurate. However, the true extent of the damage the company had caused was never fully understood. This was because Theranos had deleted encryption keys that would provide access to patient data and had destroyed evidence. But one examination indicated that the Edison device made errors in 1 out of every 2 tests, while another examination suggested that errors occurred in 14% of cases. This was 20 times the upper limit of the industry standard, which is considered to be below 1% error rate and at best 100 times worse. In other words, due to one person's insatiable ambition, hundreds of thousands of patients were dragged into panic and fear. Upon the revelation of all these facts, Theranos' laboratories were shut down, and Elizabeth Holmes and her former boyfriend Ramesh Balwani were indicted on charges spanning years, including fraud, wire fraud, evidence tampering, and providing misleading information to investors, each facing up to 20 years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. On January 3rd, 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on multiple charges by a jury, and in September 2022, she was sentenced to 11 years in prison. As you can see, this is truly an extraordinary story with many lessons to be learned. First and foremost, Silicon Valley's portrayal as a dream world of technology enthusiasts is not accurate. Young individuals are turned into competitive machines, programmed to do anything for fame and money, leading to a toxic culture. These deceptions also harm genuine entrepreneurs significantly. Similar ventures to Theranos have already seen plummeting investment rates, and potentially successful ventures are affected. The biomedical sector might have to stumble for years due to the greed of one individual. As a society, we possess incredible potential, but considering events like this, along with scandals involving companies like Facebook, it's clear that we need to reevaluate our innovation culture. Secondly, the justice system worldwide still falls short when it comes to holding perpetrators accountable. Yes, Elizabeth Holmes is probably one of the most extraordinary fraudsters we've seen lately. This is evident. Her behaviours even border on sociopathy and narcissism, according to many experts. However, since there's no official diagnosis, we're hesitant to use these terms as freely as other sources might. For instance, Elizabeth never apologised to anyone during her trial. She believed that what had happened was a simple mistake that could easily be corrected. Even when her lies were exposed, she continued to act nonchalant and indifferent. According to John Carreyrou's book Bad Blood, during a patent dispute with a former family friend, Dr. Richard Fewis, Elizabeth called as a witness a 67-year-old brilliant biochemist named Ian Gibbons who worked in her lab. Theranos was also lying about its patents, and Gibbons, who had his name on one of them, knew that if he testified in court about the deceptions, he would lose his job. Losing his job at his age would make it very difficult to find a new one. everyone, and he needed money due to his cancer treatment expenses. Fearing this, Gibbons fell into depression and chose to take his own life. He died in the hospital a week later, but Elizabeth never cared about the colleague she had co-authored a patent with. She didn't even answer his wife's calls. Although she actually promised to hold a memorial for Gibbons at work, she never organised it. She later called his wife, asking for devices like laptops that might have been at Gibbons' house. This is the kind of heartless person we're talking about. However, Holmes wasn't alone in this scheme. Many of the individuals who enabled her actions won't face enough responsibility because they weren't burdened with the same level of responsibility for public health. In fact, throughout the video, many of the names I mentioned won't face any consequences. Some of them have already managed to retrieve part or all of their money through insurance or lawsuits against Holmes. It's the hundreds of thousands of patients and citizens who suffered the consequences. We're cautious when sending even a small amount of money somewhere, worrying about potential misuse. But when hundreds of millions of dollars are poured into one entrepreneur, how is it that those who never questioned the company's practices have no blame? The point is, if we don't take the right steps in this regard in the next video, we might be discussing whose lives have been shattered by the next fraudster. Until the next video, goodbye.